We're now going to turn for this second video for July 18, 2016, continuing the history of Athens, and specifically talking about what's known as the Delian League. Before I continue, I'd like you to pause your video and please go and find on Sakai the outline that is on the schedule for July 18, 2016, so that you can see the list of events that occur in relation to the Delian League. Please pause your video. Excellent. Do you have that up for Sakai? In that case, we're ready to proceed. Now, the period that you can see written in the outline is called the Pentaconta. It's a long word that is coined by the historian Thucydides, whose name is also given to you there in the outline on Sakai. Thucydides was the principal historian whose history we have to describe for us the events of the major war that occupied the last 30 or so years of the 400s BC. It's referred to as the Peloponnesian War, although that's a little misleading because what it really is a major war between Athens and her allies and Sparta and her allies, which is effectively what the war was referred to back then. Peloponnesian War is more of a modern terminology for that particular war. So Thucydides wrote his history about a good part of that war, and he also spent a section writing about the 50 years approximately between the Persian wars that we just talked about last week and the Peloponnesian War that we're going to talk about tomorrow. In that period, Athens became extraordinarily powerful, more so than any polis had done during the archaic and now classical ages in Greek history. So with the onset of the period right after the Persian Wars, we see Athens going around putting this network of allies together, and it's going to be, Thucydides' purpose in describing it is to show how the deterioration of relations between Athens and the other cities around contributed to the outbreak of the Peloponnesian War starting in 431 BC. So for right now, I'm going to discuss what led to all that with this, again, the so-called Delian League. You may remember in a prior video, we referred to Delos. This was last Tuesday when we were talking about Delos in connection with Apollo's birth. Delos was the island out in the middle of the Aegean Sea. You should review it on your map. That became a political point of centrality for the Athenians in the Aegean Sea, because Pisistratus the tyrant got the island purified on behalf of the Athenians. Thereafter, Delos was maintained as a possession of Athens. And during this league, we have meetings that go on at Delos, as well as money that's kept there. So now, let me talk about the intent and origin of the Delian League. First of all, the problem had to do with the Persians. The Persians had just been defeated in what's referred to as the Persian Wars in 479 BC. They left, but they still occupied territory on the fringes of the Greek world, such as along the Black Sea and also here and there among the Ionians. And the concern was that the Persians would return and reinvade and try another campaign and possibly cause much more destruction. So initially the Spartans attempted to lead a campaign against the Persians, especially up in the Black Sea region, to get the Persians to leave. Their general, however, Pausanias, one of their kings, turned out not to be up to the task and eventually was recalled. After that, the Athenians took over the task of confronting the Persians. The way they went about it, and this was especially the instrumentation of Themistocles, our gentleman from before who won this Battle of Salamis, was to go around to all of the islands and cities in Ionia and in the Aegean Sea and tell them that if they paid tribute every year to Athens, either ships or money that would be used to maintain the Athenian navy, the Athenians would see to it that the Persians were kept away. And at that time, that was regarded as a genuine threat, so islands and cities were reasonably okay with going along with this arrangement. That meant that there would be annual meetings held on the island of Delos Each member of this big league would be entitled to one vote on Athenian policy, and the intent of this whole thing was to protect all of the islands and cities under the aegis of Athens from getting later on attacked by the Persians. Or if there was an attack, there would be protection where the Athenians could come along with their ships in order to rebuff them again if necessary. So the origin of the Delian League essentially is the fear of reconquest by the Persians. And in intent, it seemed okay. So all the islands and cities in question joined. Now, I'd like you to pause your video at this point and locate the handout that's in resources and is also attached to the schedule that's called Athenian Empire. Please pause your video. It's another map. Okay, if you have that map open, Athenian Empire, you'll see in yellow the whole area that is occupied by Athenian power. And of course you can see in red where Athens is itself. So the area in yellow comprises Athenian allies in the Delian League, cities or islands. I want to make it very clear that Delian League is not the correct term for this league. Back then it was simply called Athens and her allies, more accurately because Athens was really in control of all these allies, as it would turn out. Delian League is the modern term given to this league for convenience, but especially because it did meet the island of Delos. But that's not in fact what the original arrangement was called back then. All right, well, how did this go? Well, for about 10 years, the Athenians did indeed go out and combat the Persians where they could find them. The thing that got suspicious, though, was that the Athenians kept on forcing other cities into the Delian League that really didn't necessarily need to worry about Persian invasion, such as a city called Charistus on the island of Euboea, which was a small city that presumably the Persians wouldn't bother with, most likely. So that got some of these other cities a little bothered about this whole arrangement. There was also another bother with Sparta. Sparta certainly appreciated the Athenians' successes in thwarting the Persians at sea, but not long after the Persian wars concluded, there was a bit of controversy that broke up between Sparta and Athens about whether or not Athens was allowed to have walls around its city. Sparta was opposed to cities having walls, and especially the type of walls the Athenians wanted, because the Athenians wanted to wall off the Piraeus harbor as well as the city. So Themistocles, our very clever Athenian, went off to Sparta to negotiate about whether or not to build walls. And he pulled off a long stall tactic that allowed the Athenians to build the walls while Themistocles kept the Spartans busy. And by the time the Spartans went to check to find out what was going on, the walls were all built. And Themistocles, of course, came up with loads of apologies. So sorry there was a miscommunication, the Spartans were very upset. But they said nothing about it, because the Athenians maybe were entitled to the walls. They just didn't appreciate that kind of treatment. Nonetheless, the Spartans went along with the arrangement, and the Spartans and the Athenians, for a little while anyway, stayed in reasonably good shape. Other cities, however, got a little more restive. For instance, 467 BC, Naxos, an island, a big wealthy island out in the Aegean Sea, decided that they did not want Athenian protection anymore, and they tried to rebel out of the Delian League, secede from it. Well, there was the fine print, the devil is in the details, that nobody bothered to read. Permanent membership, cannot leave, will suffer major retribution from the Athenians in the form of garrisoning of your island or city, and so on. Nobody read that. So Naxos tried to get out. The Athenians came over and squelched the rebellion. Now that got a lot of cities very suspicious that something was amiss with this league, that maybe there was more going on than it appeared. Still, though, at that moment, there was still combat between Persians and the Athenians, so still nobody said too much about it. However, the following year, the very successful general Cimon stepped up to the fore. Now, Cimon had a very distinguished history because his father was Miltiades. And Miltiades was the winning general at Marathon in 490 BC. What was especially interesting about Miltiades is that he had to convince one of the archons, known as the Polemarch archon, the one in charge of war, to actually carry out a campaign of resistance against the Persians when the Persians landed at Marathon. Because the 10 generals were divided 5 and 5 as to whether or not they wanted to do that. And Miltiades gave a speech given to us by Herodotus, the historian, to Callimachus, the Polemarchus archon, saying, we need to go fight and try to win this battle. So Cimon was his son. And Cimon is the one who gets the credit for successfully defeating the Persians in 466 BC at the Eurymedon river mouth over in Asia Minor. As a result, the Persians and the Greeks made peace. A guy named Callias from Athens brokered the peace, and the agreement was made that the Persians would stay in back of their territory, and the Greeks would stay in back of their territory. So Greeks this way, and Persians that way. And as a result, conflicts ended between the Greeks and the Persians. Now, did the Athenians go and stop the Delian League the way they should have? Of course not. All that money and power? No. This is where another man named Pericles shows up. Pericles was the antithesis of Cimon, because Cimon wanted to keep basically good relations with other Greek cities, especially Sparta. Pericles wanted to build up Athenian power. He had observed the way the Athenians had acted during the war, and he wanted to see the Athenians built up, especially if it meant keeping down other cities like the Spartans. And so, what happened? Pericles waited a year after Cimon's big victory, and then when Cimon was victorious in another battle, Pericles had Cimon brought up on charges of embezzlement. It went to trial, and it was thrown out because it was absurd. But then there was another unfortunate incident. The Spartans had a whole lot of serfs. They were called helots, Helots, who were always looking for an opportunity to rebel. And there were many, many more helots than there were real Spartans. The helots were the slaves basically in charge of manning the huge estates that the wealthy Spartans owned. And in 464 BC, there was an earthquake. And when the earthquake happened, the Helots revolted and they raced off to the southwest corner of the Peloponnesus and climbed up Mount Ithome to hold themselves up there in rebellion. The Spartans called in allies everywhere in an emergency, but somebody told them, wait a minute, but what if the Athenians come? Well, first the Spartans wanted the Athenians to come, but then somebody said, but wait a minute, the Athenians will tell everybody how wonderful democracy is. Oh, that's right, the Spartans suddenly realized. So the Athenians were called in as an ally to help with the Helot rebellion. But when the Spartans got the Athenians there, they told the Athenians, thank you, but your services are not required. You may go home. The Athenians were very angry. And now all of a sudden, Pericles went into motion. He actually arranged for a thing called an ostracism in Athens, which was a way of voting somebody out of office if it was believed that that person was getting too powerful or was acting in some way disadvantageously to the city of Athens. He arranged with his cronies to get Cimon out. And then he changed the government all around so that now the people were in control instead of all these older institutions that Solon had been in charge of. You may remember this council. The Areopagus Council. That was the one that Solon put in place with his new government back in 594 BC in order to take care of jury trials. That is the council that was featured, you may remember, at the end of Eumenides. That council now loses its power in 462 BC when Pericles strips it and gives the power of jury trials now to the general populace. Not surprisingly, they loved that because they got paid every day that they served on the jury. A little daily pittance, 2 obols or 3 obols in Athenian currency, which basically meant that they could live day by day serving on the jury if they wanted to. And many of the older citizens in Athens actually did that, and that is satirized in Aristophanes' play Wasps later in the 4th century BC. All right, so Cimon ends up out after having had all these military successes. So by now it's getting a little suspicious around. And not only that, but there was another ally right after the Persian peace, 465 BC, Thasos, an island way up north in the Aegean, got into a conflict with Athens about gold mines up there. Who was going to have the right to the gold? Then they stopped paying their tribute. Another rebellion. It took 3 years for the Athenians finally to reduce Thasos. And by now, there was a lot of bad press getting around the Athenians. It was in the middle of that 3-year-long siege that the earthquake happened at Sparta. And so this is the first point where we see relations deteriorating between the Spartans and their allies and the Athenians and their allies. So now, more trouble. 461 BC. Corinth, a Spartan ally, and Megara, at that point an Athenian ally, get into a border dispute. Corinth runs to Sparta, Megara runs to Athens. Corinth is so upset that the Megarians had the audacity to call on the Athenians, that the Corinthians, call for the Spartans to inflict some kind of counterattack against the Athenians. The Spartans do it. And there is now a war. It's usually referred to as the First Peloponnesian War between Athens and Sparta. And it dragged on for 15 years, 461 to 446 BC. Now, in the end, it came to a peace, 446 BC. It didn't work out very well for Pericles and the Athenians. The Athenians actually, in 457 BC, during that war, successfully invaded Boeotia and took over the region around Thebes. They could have actually kept Thebes under their power. But unfortunately, in 447 BC, in a battle called Coronea, the Athenians lost the Thebans back. And right at that same time, the island of Euboea revolted, and Megara also rescinded its alliance with Athens and went off to Sparta. As a result, the Athenians suddenly had 3 disasters right in their backyard, so to speak, and Pericles could only really deal with one effectively, so he chose to deal with Euboea because of Euboea's importance for travel across the Aegean Sea. As a result, Thebes got out and went on to build a big confederacy of Boeotian cities on her own, and Megara got out and became a permanent Spartan ally, never again to be loyal to the Athenians. And it turned out that was for good reason, because the Athenians were very nasty to the Megarians later on, as we'll talk about in tomorrow's video on the Peloponnesian War. So, in the midst of all this, we have this war going on, and then we have, guess what, another disaster. 454 BC, the Athenians, in trying to fight the war with Sparta, are trying also to secure more alliances, and they go to Egypt because there happens to be a rebellion going on there of one faction trying to get rid of Persian rule. The Athenians sail a fleet up the Nile River trying to break down the faction that's in favor of Persian rule. The fleet gets stuck up there and is destroyed. The Athenians are suddenly frantic, and Pericles takes advantage of the moment to call for the Delian treasury, all that money that was being paid in to the Athenians for the alliance's protection from the Persians. All that money is evacuated from Delos and now brought to Athens and stored on the Athenian Acropolis. Thereafter, the peace with Persia is renewed, and then Pericles goes to work with all that money. He starts to build up the Athenian city, especially all the buildings on the Acropolis. When the Persians sacked the city back in 480 BC, right before the Battle of Salamis, they destroyed all of the holy sacraments up on the Acropolis, all the old temples. Now, they all got rebuilt. Today's monuments that you see in Athens on the Acropolis, including the Parthenon, all those marble structures, were built at this time for the next 15 years from 447 to 432 BC. Actually, completed in 433 BC, dedicated 432 BC. And it's all built from the money paid in by the Allies for an entirely different purpose. That was talked about, not very pleasantly, for those 15 years. Okay, but these are all the ways that Pericles, after the Persian peace, gradually starts building up Athenian power. And when allies start making noise about, well, now that the Persians have been twice agreed with, reconciled with. Now, why do we have to have this league? So Pericles' response to that was something called a kleroky, which in Greek means an allotment by chance. It was a form of colonization, effectively, but what Pericles does with it is to go to various allies and plant Athenian citizens into the city, basically by lot, taking land away from the natives. And that had a very bad effect on Athenian ally relations, as it turns out. So all of these things were going on. Now, the big rebellion, you should check this on your map, the big rebellion that really caused major trouble for the Athenians, 441 BC, was the rebellion at Samos that I mentioned in the last video, and I'll conclude here with this rebellion. This is the one that Sophocles and Pericles went out together to squelch, and they did. When they did it, they then garrisoned the island, they killed off a portion of the male population, they enslaved a portion of the women and children, and they altered the constitution so that it would now stay pro-democracy. This was such a major defeat of rebellion that it scared all the other allies, and rebellions thereafter were stopped. So it seemed at this point, now, despite all these problems that had happened before, we had peace with Persia. We eventually, in 446 BC, had peace with Sparta, and the allies are no longer rebelling. So it seemed that everything was working out well. But it was a very precarious setup, and it would take only one small incident in a city far, far away, long, long ago, in order to get the entire Greek world to be ruptured into one of the worst wars and longest wars of its history. This is what we will return to talk about tomorrow, July 19th, 2016, as we also look very briefly at Euripides' Medea. We will also consider what exactly happened in the Peloponnesian War. One reminder, please make certain that you complete your two presentations of an Aeschylean character and a Sophoclean character. Please make sure that I get those on Sakai, preferably in your Dropbox. Okay, thank you, and we'll see you tomorrow for the conclusion of Greek history and Greek mythology with Euripides' Medea and the Peloponnesian War.